A millionaire knocked on the door to collect late rent. But when the door opened, he didn't expect to see a little black girl sewing until her fingers bled. It was a chilly autumn afternoon in Detroit, where rows of crumbling buildings were slowly being transformed by investors hoping to gentrify the area. Ethan Graves, a 41-year-old real estate mogul and CEO of Gravestone Holdings, had just closed a deal on a rundown apartment complex in one of the city's oldest neighborhoods. Known for his cold precision and sharp business instincts, Ethan rarely involved himself in the day-to-day matters of his properties. But this time was different. One tenant was 3 weeks behind on rent, and something about the delay rubbed him the wrong way. Dressed in a crisp navy suit and stepping out of his Tesla Model X, he decided to handle the matter personally, a show of force disguised as concern. As he climbed the cracked stairwell and knocked on the peeling apartment door, he expected excuses, maybe even hostility. What he found instead left him speechless. When the door creaked open, Ethan Graves found himself frozen in the doorway, completely unprepared for what he saw. A young black girl, no older than 11, sat hunched over an old, rattling sewing machine. Her tiny fingers were wrapped in mismatched bandages, and dark circles shadowed her eyes as if sleep had long forgotten her. The apartment was dimly lit and unbearably quiet, save for the mechanical rhythm of the sewing needle-piercing fabric. The wallpaper peeled in slow curls from the walls, and the floor creaked under even the smallest step. Yet the room had an unexpected sense of order. Neatly folded piles of colorful fabric lined the walls, stacked with an almost reverent care. In the middle of that fading room, the girl looked up at Ethan with a strange mix of weariness and calm. "My mom's sleeping. She has a fever," she said in a soft, steady voice that didn't quite match her age. "But I can help you if you need something." Ethan, standing in the hallway in a perfectly tailored Armani suit, custom loafers, and an expensive overcoat still crisp from the valet, suddenly felt like an intruder in sacred territory. His well-rehearsed speech about late payments and penalties faded on his tongue. He glanced around, half expecting an adult to appear from the shadows to take over the conversation, but there was no one. The girl, later he would learn her name was Amira, didn't flinch under his gaze, nor did she show fear. Instead, she returned to her task with a quiet resolve, the way someone much older might return to unfinished business. Ethan stepped hesitantly into the apartment, the contrast between his polished presence and the worn carpet beneath his shoes almost jarring. He had walked into thousands of units before, investments, liabilities, flips, but none had ever made him pause like this. There was something hauntingly dignified in the way Amira moved, the way she held the fabric taut and straight, as though the world depended on it. The sharp smell of rubbing alcohol and menthol lingered in the air, hinting at home remedies and long nights. Ethan cleared his throat, unsure of how to proceed. "I'm here about the rent," he managed, adjusting his tie out of habit more than necessity. Amira didn't argue. She simply nodded, stood up from her seat, and walked over to a wooden box in the corner. From it, she pulled out a crumpled envelope and handed it to him. "It's only half," she explained. "The rest will come when I finish these dresses." Ethan took the envelope without speaking, feeling the weight of the worn dollar bills in his hand and something heavier pressing on his chest. He had come expecting confrontation or excuses. What he found instead was quiet strength, resilience, and a young girl carrying far more than any child should. As he turned to leave, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a story much larger than a missed rent payment. Amira handed Ethan a crumpled envelope, the edges worn soft from handling, and looked up at him with steady eyes that held none of the hesitation he expected from a child. "It's only half," she said plainly. "The rest will come when I finish the orders." Inside the envelope were a few creased 20s, 5s, and singles, painstakingly counted and tucked together, barely enough to cover even 1 week's rent. Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown by how calm and direct she was, how her words carried the weight of someone twice her age. He didn't know what was more unsettling: the fact that this 11-year-old girl was negotiating rent with the confidence of an adult, or the fact that she clearly believed it was her responsibility to do so. Before he could respond, a harsh, rattling cough erupted from the back room, loud, raw, and relentless. the kind of cough that stopped a conversation cold. Amira didn't flinch. She simply glanced in the direction of the sound, then back at Ethan. "My mum's sick," she said evenly. "It's pneumonia. She doesn't have insurance." Her voice didn't rise or crack. She wasn't looking for pity. She was stating facts, the way someone might talk about the weather. Ethan's gaze flicked toward the darkened hallway behind her, but he couldn't see anything. Still, the coughing continued, almost in rhythm with the sewing machine's quiet hum. The layers of the situation were hitting him all at once. The late rent, the child acting as the head of the household, the sick mother in the next room, and the threadbare surroundings that suggested this wasn't some temporary hardship, but a long-standing reality. He opened his mouth to say something, he wasn't sure what, when Amira added, almost like an afterthought, "She used to sew too. Before she got worse, I'm just finishing what she couldn't." Ethan found himself gripping the envelope a little too tightly, his knuckles whitening around the fragile paper. His instinct told him to say something official, something about policies, deadlines, late fees. But none of it seemed to make sense here, in this dim apartment filled with the quiet labor of a child trying to hold her world together. There was no anger in her, no defiance, just this relentless sense of duty that made his own sense of professionalism feel hollow. He nodded stiffly, murmured a polite thank you, and turned to leave, the weight of the envelope still in his hand. As he walked back down the cracked stairwell and into the late afternoon chill, something in him shifted. He had dealt with hundreds of tenants in his career, some pleasant, some entitled, some forgettable. But none had stayed with him like this. He couldn't stop picturing Amira's fingers, wrapped in makeshift bandages, guiding fabric through the machine with quiet urgency. He kept seeing the calm in her eyes, the responsibility in her voice. Back in his Tesla, he sat with the engine off for a long time, staring at the apartment building through the windshield. For the first time in years, Ethan Graves wasn't thinking about late fees, spreadsheets, or profit margins. He was thinking about a little girl who had just challenged everything he thought he knew about strength. 2 days later, while sitting in a boardroom discussing development timelines and investment returns, Ethan's phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it at first, but when it rang again seconds later, he excused himself and answered. "Mr. Graves, this is St. Mary's Hospital. You've been listed as the emergency contact for a patient, Dana Moore." Ethan blinked, confused. The name didn't register immediately, but then it clicked. Amira's mother. "There must be a mistake," he started to say, but the voice on the line continued, "Her daughter provided your name and number." Within the hour, Ethan was in the hospital lobby, still dressed in his tailored suit, standing awkwardly beneath the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. On a hard plastic chair by the reception desk sat Amira, looking smaller than he remembered, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. She didn't stand when she saw him, didn't cry or run to him like a frightened child. Instead, she simply looked up and said, "They wouldn't let me stay with her. They said I need an adult. I gave them your name because you're the landlord, and the only grown-up I know who came back." Her explanation was so simple, so heartbreakingly logical, that Ethan felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't asking for charity or protection. She was just trying to keep her mother from being alone. After speaking briefly with the nurse, who confirmed Dana's condition had worsened, pneumonia complicated by an undiagnosed underlying condition, Ethan signed the temporary guardian paperwork, his hand hesitating only slightly before putting pen to paper. He told himself it was just for now, just to avoid the chaos of social services. But deep down, he already knew that wasn't the whole truth. Over the next several days, Ethan became more involved than he ever intended to be. He drove Amira to school, dropped off extra clothes at the hospital, and started noticing little details, like how she kept a notebook full of appointments, fabric orders, and payment logs written in a tidy, adult hand. One evening, while waiting for Amira to finish her homework at his condo, Ethan saw her carefully place a thick folder back into her backpack. "What's that?" he asked casually. Amira looked at him, hesitant at first, then pulled out the folder and handed it over. Inside were old contracts, faded receipts, and correspondence dating back nearly 2 decades. Her mother, Dana, had been a seamstress for the previous owner of the apartment building. handcrafting uniforms for construction workers, office staff, even tenants. She'd never been formally employed, but had worked under a verbal agreement that promised future housing credits and partial equity once the neighborhood redevelopment took off. The agreement had never been honored. The documents were organized in a way that surprised Ethan, dates aligned, annotations in different pens, even a few clippings from community newsletters that mentioned Dana's contribution. She kept everything, Amira said softly, even when she got sick. She told me it was important, that it meant something. For Ethan, the realization hit hard. This wasn't just about rent, or charity, or even kindness. It was about accountability. A quiet injustice had been festering beneath one of his properties, and the only person brave enough to confront it was a little girl who refused to let her mother's work be forgotten. 1 week after taking temporary custody of Amira, Ethan found himself sitting across from her at the kitchen island in his high-rise condo, as she quietly pulled a thick manila envelope from her backpack and placed it in front of him. "My mum told me to hold on to this," she said, her voice steady. She said one day someone would need to see the truth. Inside was a carefully preserved collection of documents, faded contracts from nearly 2 decades ago, detailing Dana Moore's work as an off-the-books seamstress for Gravestone Holdings, back when the company was still under the leadership of Ethan's late father, Charles Graves. The contracts described Dana's role in producing custom uniforms for workers across multiple properties during the early redevelopment years, uniforms that helped brand the company's expansion, though her name never appeared on any official payroll. Attached to the contracts were hand-signed receipts promising housing credits, continued employment, and even partial ownership once the project succeeded. None of it had ever been honored. Ethan stared at the signatures, his father's handwriting unmistakable next to Dana's name, dated over 19 years ago. But it wasn't just the contracts. Amira had added her own research, printouts of archived emails she found in the condo's printer tray, snippets of overheard phone calls, even notes she had written in her school notebook during board meetings Ethan had taken her to. "You kept all this?" Ethan asked, stunned. Amira nodded, then pulled out a folded photograph, yellowed with time. In it, a younger Dana stood at a construction site, smiling beside a group of workers in matching jackets she had sewn. Next to her stood Charles Graves. "That's my mom," Amira said, her eyes locked on his. "And that's your father, I think." Her words lingered in the air longer than Ethan expected. The resemblance in the photo, the proximity, the way his father's arm rested casually on Dana's shoulder, it all suggested a closeness that went far beyond business. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, slowly at first, then violently. The next day, against every instinct he'd built as a businessman, raised in a world of tight-lipped family secrets, he scheduled a private DNA test. The results came back within days. Amira Moore was not just the daughter of a forgotten seamstress. She was Charles Graves's biological granddaughter, his niece. The revelation hit Ethan harder than any financial loss he'd ever experienced. The entire foundation of his company, his inheritance, his name, was suddenly entangled with a legacy of promises broken, lives exploited, and truths buried. Amira, the quiet girl who sewed late into the night to pay rent, had unknowingly unraveled a secret his father had kept hidden for decades. What struck Ethan most wasn't just the betrayal, it was the composure with which Amira had handled it all. She hadn't sought revenge or attention. She had simply preserved the evidence, knowing one day someone might care enough to listen. And now, staring at the truth spread out before him, Ethan realized he had only 2 choices: ignore what he'd learned and protect the empire built on silence, or do what no one in his family had ever done before and make it right. At the next board meeting of Gravestone Holdings, Ethan walked into the executive conference room, knowing the air had already been poisoned against him. Rumors had spread fast. One board member in particular, Howard Madsen, had been quietly rallying votes to remove him as CEO. The accusation that Ethan had compromised the integrity of the company by involving himself too personally with a minor who had no proven family connection, suggesting that his recent behavior raised concerns about his judgment and leadership. Ethan let the whispers circle the table before calmly placing a laptop in front of him and connecting it to the projector. Without a word, he began displaying a series of documents, contracts dating back 20 years, bearing his father's signature, promising stock options and housing credits to a group of underpaid seamstresses and laborers who had built the foundation of the company. Then he presented the altered versions, revised documents with signatures traced over, terms omitted, and legal disclaimers inserted by Gravestone's former legal team to absolve the company of any obligation. The room fell silent. "These are not just clerical errors," Ethan said, his voice measured but resolute. "They are deliberate acts of fraud carried out to avoid compensating black workers who helped build this company." He paused, then projected the DNA test results, confirming Amira Moore as the biological granddaughter of Charles Graves. "That child you say I have no relation to. She is my family, and she's the reason I uncovered all of this." A few gasps broke through the silence, and the tension at the table shifted from indignation to unease. Ethan continued, announcing the creation of the Moore Reparations Fund, an initiative funded with 35% of his personal company shares, designated to compensate families who were promised equity and never received it. "This isn't a gesture," he clarified. "This is restitution." Then came the final move, a vote to change the company's name from Gravestone Holdings to Graves and Moore Equity, symbolizing not only a new era of accountability, but also recognition of a legacy that had been buried for far too long. "I'm also legally adopting Amira," Ethan said, turning to face the room. "Not out of obligation, but because she belongs here, more than most of us." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, surprisingly, it was board chairwoman Lillian Chen who broke the silence. "We were founded on exploitation. Maybe it's time we're redefined by redemption." The vote to keep Ethan as CEO passed unanimously, with Howard Madsen notably abstaining. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He felt grounded. For the first time in his life, he wasn't defending a company. He was rebuilding a truth. Outside the boardroom, reporters were already gathering, tipped off about a leadership shakeup. Ethan stepped up to the podium with Amira beside him and made it official. "My father built this company," he said, "but my niece saved it. We will no longer profit off silence. We will invest in justice." Behind him, the new company logo was unveiled, Graves and Moore Equity, etched onto the building in polished steel, marking a future shaped not by inheritance, but by integrity. 1 year later, under the golden light of an early September morning, Ethan stood beside Amira at the grand opening of the Moore Graves Center for Design and Justice, a creative institute for underserved youth in Detroit specializing in fashion, sewing, and entrepreneurial education. The audience was packed with local families, former tenants, city officials, and reporters from national networks, all there to witness the transformation of a story that had once been hidden in the shadows of a forgotten apartment building. Amira, now 12, wore a custom-made dress of her own design, sleek lines, bold colors, and hand-stitched detailing that paid homage to her mother's original patterns. As she cut the ribbon and stepped forward to speak, cameras flashed and applause echoed. She didn't give a long speech, just a single sentence that would later be quoted across headlines and social media feeds. "Sewing helped me survive, but telling the truth helped me live." Later, in a nationally televised interview, Ethan sat beside her, his demeanor quieter, more grounded than it had been a year earlier. When asked what had changed him most, he replied, "I used to think my greatest asset was my real estate portfolio. But it turns out it was a little girl with a sewing kit and a spine of steel. She didn't just help me see the truth, she helped me earn back something far rarer, a sense of honor." The journey that began with a knock on a door had evolved into something no spreadsheet could measure, a legacy built not on profit, but on purpose. The lesson learned through this journey is one that reaches far beyond the walls of a boardroom or the confines of a courtroom. Privilege can blind you, not with arrogance, but with comfort. It convinces you that the world you see is the world that exists. But true vision requires discomfort. It demands that you step outside of what's familiar and listen to the voices that have been ignored for too long. Amira's courage was not loud. It wasn't performed on a stage or backed by applause. It was quiet, persistent, and rooted in love. For her mother, for truth, and for a future she refused to give up on. Real bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums from the corner of a room, under the buzz of a sewing machine. Sometimes it's a child who refuses to accept injustice as normal. The truth is, there are Amiras in every neighborhood, invisible to the powerful, yet powerful beyond belief. And if we have the courage to see them, to stand with them instead of above them, we might not just change their futures, we might redeem our own. Justice isn't a courtroom drama. It's the day someone with power decides to stop speaking and start listening. It's when integrity outweighs legacy, and when making it right becomes more important than being right. The legacy of Graves and more equity is no longer about empire. It's about empathy, and the truth stitched into every thread of that transformation. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see the world a little differently, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to X Daily Stories for more powerful narratives that reveal how ordinary moments can lead to extraordinary change. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs to hear that even the smallest act of courage can unravel injustice. Join us as we tell the stories that matter, because truth deserves to be seen, heard, and shared.